The Alaska Center for Energy and Power, Dan gave a good introduction in terms of its background. We are doing near-term applied energy research. What we're really trying to do is look for solutions to Alaska's energy issues. We want to be involved with developing projects that make sense technically, projects that make sense economically, and looking at ways to reduce the cost of energy for Alaskans, and also just to kind of stabilize our energy supply and make sure that we have a sustainable energy supply into the future. I want to start out by talking a little bit about the big picture and where our energy comes from and how we use it, both nationally, around the world, and in Alaska, and even here in Fairbanks. The most basic source for most of our energy is from the sun. And I think that we're intuitively aware of how critical the sun is, especially at this time of year when we don't see it very much. But the first thing people think about when they think of the sun is they think solar power. They think solar thermal for maybe heating hot water, or solar photovoltaics like we see here on a house to generate electric power directly. But really, the sun is far more critical in terms of energy supply. Biomass energy is all driven by the sun. The wood that we're cutting is part of is grown through photosynthesis, which is energy from the sun. That's essentially carbon that's being sequestered from the atmosphere through solar energy that we're burning in our wood stoves, if we're doing that. The vegetables that we grow, the food that we grow. Energy is tied to everything that we do and everything that is important to us in our society, the wealth that we enjoy today. And so it is a really critical basis of our economy and of our way of life. Energy from the sun also, maybe less intuitively, is responsible for wind, wave power. It is what those thermal differences from night and day and different parts of our climate, that's really what drives the hydrologic cycle. So we have hydropower from that, our rivers, wave energy, wind. And then also, our fossil energy resources are also originally from the sun. That's solar energy that's been stored in the earth for many millennia, but that was originally also biomass life, whether that's coal or natural gas or oil. And so that is also solar energy that's been sequestered over a period of time and that we can tap to meet our energy needs today. There are some non-solar energy sources that we do use. Nuclear is a big one. Geothermal energy from the earth is another one that we can take advantage of. And tidal energy is primarily lunar from the moon, but there's also a little bit of a solar component there as well. When we kind of look at all those different energy resources, to put them into perspective, the big yellow box at the bottom shows all of the sun's radiation that comes to the earth every year that we could potentially tap for energy. And you can see that's a huge amount when we consider the coal reserves, which is the next largest, the red box. Uranium reserves, that would be nuclear power, is the next largest. Oil, gas, and then the tiny little box on top is actually what we consume, or what we have consumed in terms of the history of mankind in terms of our energy usage. So you can see that's still a pretty small fraction, but it's significant, and a lot of that energy that we do see in this chart isn't necessarily energy that we can access because it's very diffuse. It's not very easy to get to a large enough quantity to make it economic to deliver to people for meeting their energy use. And examples of that are the hydropower little square is super tiny within the solar box, the wind energy, and the photosynthesis. So even though the solar square is really large, we really can't access most of that because it's so diffuse over such a large part of the globe. When we look at what we are using, so that little tiny box at the very top of that stack, what we are using in the world, we use oil, 37%, coal, 25%, gas, 23%. You know, Alaska is not that far off of that type of ratio. Nuclear is 6%, biomass, 4%, now we're into the renewable type of fuels. Biomass and hydro, 4% and 3%. Solar heat, 0.5%, wind, 0.3%, geothermal, 0.2%, biofuels, 0.2%, and solar photovoltaic, way less than 1%. So that just kind of gives you an idea that today we are very dependent on fossil energy resources that are from solar energy that fell on Earth a long time ago. The reason why energy needs are so critical is because it's an economic driver. And when we look at gross national product of companies, and the U.S. is one of the countries that has one of the largest gross domestic products, and we look at how much energy we consume, you can see that there's a real correlation between the economy that a country enjoys, like the United States, where we have a very high quality of living, and how much energy that we consume. Because that energy is used in industrial applications and it's used to drive our economy. And so a country like the United States is kind of that bubble, and these bubbles are the size of the population of those countries. So the United States has a population of 250 million, 300 million, and you can see that we are a very heavy energy user, one of the highest energy users in the developing world, or the developed world. Then when you take a look at countries like, I'll point out, Ethiopia is right at the axis there, the tiny little dot there. They use very, very little energy per capita, and they have very little gross domestic product per capita. So they don't have a very much of an economy. They also don't use much energy. But you can bet that people that live there, or China and India, which are the two giant circles that you see at the bottom there, because there's huge populations in those countries, they want to be moving up that red arrow there. They want to be up by where the United States is. And in order to get there, they are going to need a lot more energy per capita than what they are using today. And where those energy resources come from should really be of concern to us, because that's going to drive our future energy costs in this country and in this state. Here is just another graph showing basically what the other one indicated, which is that as we go forward into the future, we can expect our energy use to increase worldwide. And again, that's something that does impact us here in Alaska, because we are tied to international markets. Now, eventually, these fossil energy resources are going to decline. There's a lot of disagreement about what time period that might happen. If we're talking about peak oil, which is the peak production of oil, after that we produce less, that could happen today. It could have happened yesterday. It could happen 50 years from now. It could happen 100 years from now. There's a lot of disagreement about when that might be, but the bottom line is that that is going to happen at some point in time, especially with the increased demand worldwide. And so we do want to be looking at what our alternative options are, both for the state and around the world. In Alaska, we've already hit that peak production, and I think here in Fairbanks, we're particularly aware of how dependent we are on oil from the pipeline that's going down to Valdez, and the concern that this community has in terms of making sure that we can maintain that supply for as long as possible, because once that pipeline flow falls below a certain amount, whatever that amount might be, it will not be economic to continue to operate that pipeline. And this community will certainly, will hopefully have some alternatives in place by that point in time. The average American uses 107 kilowatts per day, and I think this is one of the things that scares people away from engineering and maybe from presentations like this, is all these energy units that we throw out there. What's a kilowatt? What's a British thermal unit? What's a joule? There's a lot of different units that are out there. And the bottom line is it's not really so important to understand each individual unit. They're basically like feet or inches for distance. We're talking about an energy measurement. It's just a unit of measurement. So I'm going to put it in perspective for you a little bit, what 107 kilowatts means. Lance Armstrong, during a Tour de France, puts out about 3 kilowatts during a 12-hour race, which is, I can't even imagine riding my bicycle for 12 hours. But the average output is about 250 watts per hour. I'm going to put that in Alaskan perspective, because we've got the Yukon Quest coming up here in 3 weeks. A long-distance sled dog puts out about 5 kilowatts, so quite a bit more than Lance Armstrong during a typical day on the Yukon Quest or the Iditarod. So we basically need the equivalent power output of 22 sled dogs or 35 Lance Armstrongs to generate the amount of energy needed by every American every single day. That's a lot of energy, and that's energy to run your lights, for heating, and for transportation. So that's most of your energy needs that you use. But that's a lot of energy. The way Alaska gets most of that energy is through a combination of resources The biggest one is natural gas. We have a large natural gas field in Cook Inlet, and that's really where most of our electric power is generated. Most of our heating comes from too. Some heating in Fairbanks through Fairbanks Natural Gas, but also in Anchorage, that is the primary source in the Anchorage area. Hydropower, which is considered a renewable resource by many, is 24% of Alaska's electric energy resources is from hydropower today. 10% here in Fairbanks through Golden Valley. They own a share of Bradley Lake Hydro. So 10% of our electric power is delivered through hydropower. Petroleum residual, this is basically naphtha, gasoline, any kind of petroleum distillates. That's 10%. Oil, diesel, 9%. Coal, which is primarily here in the interior, is 3%. And then the renewables, wind, solar, biomass, other than hydropower, is 0.2%. It's an incredibly small percentage of the electric power resources that we use today. So what does this mean financially? What does this mean in terms of dollars? If we assume a constant fuel demand for the next 20 years, we're on track to spend over $5 billion on diesel fuel in rural Alaska and $60 billion on fossil fuels for rail belt electric power generation. That's if we do nothing. That's a lot of money, and that's assuming a constant fuel price based on estimates come up that have been developed by the Energy Information Agency through the Department of Energy. That's what we're going to be on track to pay. So that's a pretty big bill. It makes the case for renewable energy a little more appealing because the capital costs are higher for renewable energy projects than for fossil fuel projects. But once you pay those capital costs, you really don't have any additional fuel costs. The exception is biomass, but that's generally locally purchased, assuming that you're growing that biomass locally or harvesting it locally. But you don't have any major fuel costs with wind power, with hydro, once you put the infrastructure in place. And that equals stable prices. You know what your fuel cost is going to be 20 years from now. And today, I can guarantee you that no one in this room, we could do a lottery, and you would not know what a price of crude would go for 20 years from now. I've heard some really, really disparate arguments for that, from very low to quite high, you know, and everywhere in between. So we don't know. That's a problem. And knowing what your fuel cost is into the future is a very attractive proposition, especially for industrial investment, looking at economic development for the state. We're making use of local resources. They're available. We're not so dependent on long supply lines. We are at a disadvantage here in Alaska because we are at the end of many supply lines. Much of the diesel fuel for rural Alaska comes from outside the state. It's shipped up here. We're dependent on those supply lines to supply that. But also our food that we have on our shelves. If we can grow more food locally, these are all opportunities for us to be using our energy to be meeting the needs of our community. It's clean with no emissions, and emissions are becoming a more significant issue, especially with the Obama administration looking at potentially having a carbon tax structure in place in the near future. And of course, they're inexhaustible. We're not going to run out of our renewable resources as long as we're tapping them in a sustainable manner. So to talk a little bit more about Alaska and what we have available here and to our community as well, here in Fairbanks. Wind, Alaska is really fortunate, and not only do we have some of the best fossil energy resources in the world, but we also have some of the best renewable energy resources anywhere. There are few places in the world that have the same opportunities in terms of resource mix as Alaska does, and wind is a big opportunity. It is here in Fairbanks. Golden Valley Electric is looking at a wind farm down in Healy at Eva Creek. But the coastal areas of Alaska are really where we really find world-class wind resources. And that's in a lot of western Alaska and in the Aleutians. Kotzebue Electric Association was really a pioneer in the development of wind technologies in these small, remote communities. We have sort of a unique situation in Alaska where we have a large number of small, isolated grids. In fact, the entire Alaskan electric grid is an isolated grid. We're not connected to Canada. We're not connected to the lower 48. And that also makes us vulnerable. Kotzebue has integrated a number of different wind turbines into their generation system and been able to offset a lot of diesel fuel generation, which means combining wind power with existing diesel generation and kind of integrating or marrying those two technologies in a way that can reduce the amount of fossil fuel that's being burned. Railbelt wind farm projects, I mentioned Eva Creek. Fire Island down in Anchorage is another big one that's being considered. And the nice thing about those two projects is the wind blows in different times at both places, so they really complement each other well. The wind blows at Eva Creek and at Fire Island at completely different times. And one benefit there is that it balances the biggest problem with wind power, which is that it's not a consistent energy source. You can't control when the energy is blowing. You want the lights on all the time, not just when the wind is blowing. And so you need to have some kind of mechanism to store that energy or otherwise kind of compensate for the fact that that is not a consistent energy source. At the university, that's one of the big issues that we're addressing. We have the Wind Diesel Application Center that we've recently developed. It's a partnership with about 50 different industry partners. We work very closely with private sector on a lot of this technology development. We're also partnering with the National Renewable Energy Lab and Sandia National Lab and the Alaska Energy Authority on this project. The coordinator, the wind diesel coordinator for the state of Alaska, Kat Keith, is a joint position between the Alaska Energy Authority and the Alaska Center for Energy and Power. She was here today with her wind power generation for the students. We are doing a lot of testing on different types of energy storage. And this is an opportunity where Alaska can really, not only is Alaska today a leader in wind diesel technologies, but we have the opportunity to get even better, to optimize our systems, to improve what we're doing here in Alaska, and then export that knowledge and that technology while at the same time trying to reduce the cost of power for our residents. The battery in the lower right-hand corner is a large-scale, industrial-scale battery that we've been testing at our laboratory here at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, working with the manufacturer to try to optimize that system and hopefully deploy that in Kotzebue is the long-term goal for that. Geothermal is another resource that we have where, at least in the Aleutian Island chain, down there in the bottom left-hand corner, that's a volcanic arc. And there are some really world-class resources available there. The big challenge is that a lot of the geothermal resources in Alaska aren't close to population centers, and that's often a challenge with renewable resources, is that one of the biggest costs associated with developing these projects is the cost of transmission. No one's been able to really find a good way to reduce the cost of transmission. It's a high cost to a lot of these projects, and a place where, like the Aleutians, where there isn't a lot of major population centers, it makes it very challenging to develop all but the resources that are closest to population centers. But there are some that are. Macushin is one that's very close to Dutch Harbor. Mount Spur is one that is being considered for development very seriously right now. And then in the interior of the state, up there in the kind of the middle of the state, including Fairbanks, you see we have these lower temperature geothermal resources that have really been overlooked for power generation for many years, but do have actually significant potential to meet the local power needs of those populations. The way geothermal power is realized is that you have some kind of water. You need to have some kind of heat transfer mechanism. You can't, anywhere that you drill deep enough, you'll have heat. You'll be able to tap heat. The center of the earth is hot. We know that the deeper you drill, the hotter a well will get. But the problem is you also need to have some circulation. You need to have some movement of water, some fractures or some faults that allow that water to short circuit back up to the surface and deliver some of that heat back up to us in the forms of hot springs or geysers, and that we can use and tap for power generation. And then re-injecting that water back down into the ground is actually a critical component of a lot of these geothermal projects around the world. It's been really realized that we can maximize the resource by re-injecting the spent fluid, making sure that we're retaining the pressure and being able to kind of maintain that resource over a long period of time. Here's a few examples. This is a heat flow map of the state of Alaska. You can see there's an area of high heat flow that goes through the middle of the state. But the problem with this map, which was created by Southern Methodist University, is it's based on very few data points. And one of the things we've been trying to do is refine and improve this map, because probably our resources are a lot more spotty. We don't have as many good resources as this map might indicate, but there still is a lot of potential. Chena Hot Springs is the only developed geothermal project for power generation in the state of Alaska. Pilgrim Hot Springs is one where there's been a lot of interest, and we actually have a Department of Energy funded project that was received by the University of Alaska to work with the community of Nome and Mary's Igloo Native Corporation out on the Seward Peninsula to assess that resource for power generation. Manly, a little bit north of here, and Circle also certainly have potential and are about the same scale as the Chena resource. Chena's really put Alaska on the map for geothermal because they've done not only space heating, power generation, refrigeration with their ice museum, and in food production. They've really done everything they can do to maximize use of that resource. And this is an interesting project that I've been fortunate enough to participate in. And a couple advantages that have been realized with the Chena project is, number one, Alaska can actually use cold to its advantage. And the fact that we have cold weather here in the winter, and that's when we need power the most, has actually been one of the things that has made Chena so successful. Because the temperature difference between your hot water and the cold air or the cold water that you have available, that temperature difference is going to tell you how much power you can make. That's just a thermodynamic law. You can't change it. And so the fact that we have a lot of cold here is actually great because we don't need quite as much hot to make the same amount of power. So we're pretty fortunate in Alaska to have so much cold air. But it's also just an interesting project because it is the lowest temperature resource ever used worldwide, and it has definitely changed some of the thinking in terms of how we can use equipment to generate power today. University of Alaska does a lot of work in geothermal resource assessment. We work with a lot of different communities around the state to take a look at their resources and how best to develop those. This is an example. We worked last summer with NANA Regional Corporation out in western Alaska to look at one of the better resources in our region. It's Granite Mountain. It was very remote. We had to fly a helicopter in there and took a look at that resource. We located or identified a fault that was controlling that geothermal system and kind of put some boundaries on how much power you might be able to generate from that resource. And unfortunately, we all concluded at the end that it was too far away from the nearest community to really warrant development because it wasn't large enough to do a project that could really have regional significance. We work very closely with the Geophysical Institute on a lot of our geothermal projects. The Pilgrim Hot Springs project I mentioned that was recently funded is based on an innovative geothermal exploration technique that we hope will really reduce the cost of exploration around the state and in other places in the world that have these types of low temperature geothermal resources. It's based on some very complex processing of thermal images of basically using infrared cameras and then doing some very complicated algorithms to process that data that was developed for volcano research. And what we want to do is we want to use those same techniques to try to reduce the cost of geothermal exploration by doing it through airborne imaging instead of what's currently being done, which is drilling wells. And drilling wells is very expensive. So if we can reduce that cost by being able to get a snapshot of the resource and figuring out exactly how much heat you're losing to the surface, we can have a pretty good idea of how big of a project we can develop on that resource sustainably over time, just based on what's been done at other sites around the world. There's a lot of good information on geothermal. So that's the plan for the Pilgrim Hot Springs work, and that will probably be starting up this summer. We also work with the Petroleum Development Lab and on reservoir modeling. We use a lot of the skills that the university's developed for petroleum engineering that can be also adapted toward geothermal energy. And so we have been looking at developing more specific reservoir models of sites like Chena Hot Springs or like Pilgrim so we can make long-term decisions about production and injection and make sure that those resources are sustainable over a long period of time. Hydropower, I already mentioned that Alaska hydropower supplies about 24% of our electric energy. Some of that on the rail belt, but a lot of that is in Southeast, where our best hydro resources exist. We have about 27 projects around the state that exist right now, and there is significant untapped hydro potential in the state. The two largest that have been discussed most recently are Susitna and Chakachamna, which is down in Cook Inlet. Bradley Lake is the one that supplies the rail belt right now. It's down across the inlet by Homer. And Golden Valley, 10% of its electric power is from hydro. There's also a new type of opportunity that's being considered. It's called hydrokinetic energy. And this is where you're taking direct advantage of moving water. So you're sticking a turbine, think of it as like putting a windmill underwater or something like that. Not quite the same, but a similar concept. You have a certain area and blades, and you're basically taking advantage directly of the moving water in our rivers. And this is an opportunity potentially for some of our rural communities. This particular turbine is a very tiny turbine. It was 5 kilowatts, so it really could only handle maybe a few homes at most in terms of power generation. But it was installed in Ruby 2 years ago, and it was the first turbine that was installed anywhere in the United States in a river environment. So Alaska has sort of had the opportunity to take a little bit of a leadership role because we have rivers that we have access to for this type of project. And there's a lot of interest in this in the state. Eagle has funding right now to install a larger version, 5 times larger, but the same manufacturer of this turbine that you see here. You just see the generator. The turbine is actually down in the water there, and it's mounted on a barge. So Eagle's going to be doing that project next summer. And there's another one that's going to go into Nenana the summer after that. That is being worked on by the Nenana City and Tribal Council along with Ocean Renewable Power Company. And speaking of the oceans, Alaska also has really world-class ocean energy resources. We have about 50% of the tidal energy resources of the United States and about 90% of our wave potential. The problem is that these are not really commercial technologies. It's very difficult to buy a wave generator or a tidal generator off the shelf today. So that's something that's still being developed, but we need to keep an eye on because we do have the second highest tidal range in North America in Cook Inlet. So that's near Anchorage, and so that's close to a population center. There's a lot of opportunity for this kind of project. In Nenana, we have a hydrokinetic test center. So hydrokinetics covers both in-river turbines as well as tidal energy projects. And we are basically looking at the resource issues around this type of in-river turbine or hydrokinetic device. So we're looking at fish issues, we're looking at ice issues, debris, how do you handle trees, submerged trees coming down the river, all of those kinds of issues. How do you anchor these devices? That's what we're looking at to support the industry and development of the industry moving forward, because those are critical issues that they need to address before these turbines can really be installed in our rural communities. Biomass is another resource that we have available. This is an example of how much biomass, this is created by the Alaska Energy Authority, and this is how much biomass we have on a sustainable basis that we could produce for heating, for power generation in the state. And the thing that's kind of interesting, we have at the bottom there a statewide energy consumption graph, and this is in trillion British thermal units per year, but the units aren't really important. What's important is that the wood energy could really only supply, or the biomass energy, about 1/3 of the total energy that we need in this state on an annual basis. And that's a pretty interesting number because clearly biomass is not the solution. You can't just look at biomass to supply all of Alaska's energy. And that's something that's really common with all the renewable energy resources. You can't just focus on one opportunity. You need to be looking at a suite of different options based on what the resources are. And this is a perfect example of non-sustainable use of biomass. This is Fairbanks, back I think in 1920 era or so. So all that wood is to provide electric power for downtown Fairbanks. Back in the early part of this century, or the last century now. And that is all going to the power plant that's way back under the D in old up there. See that? That's a lot of wood. Today, some of the communities are doing space heating. Obviously, we use wood for individual homes and wood stoves, but there's also opportunities for doing more larger, multi-building types of space heating. This is a wood boiler that's in Dot Lake that heats 9 homes. There's also a similar system that's in Tanana, or a couple of them. And a number of other systems that have been installed around the state, and those are economic. They can reduce the cost of heating energy, which is often actually more than our electric energy costs. The goal is really to be able to produce both heat and power. That's the greatest efficiency that we can achieve, is by doing both of them in the same cycle. That is a challenge at the small scale that we have for need in our rural communities. For the larger scale systems, we can do that using a steam turbine. It's done in many places in the lower 48 and around the world, but you need a lot of wood to supply that kind of system, and a place like Fairbanks can't necessarily provide that much wood. So we're looking at these smaller systems. They're more complex, they're more expensive, and they're not readily commercially available. Fish oil is another opportunity for some of our coastal regions in particular. There's about 8 million gallons processed annually, and there's potential for about 20 million more gallons, which is a pretty significant number when you're considering that fuel costs in some of these communities can be upwards of $5 to $10 in some of the more remote places. That can really add up. We have been researching fish oil biodiesel and fish oil use as a fuel, and one of the challenges is that it does have a shelf life. It does oxidize, and it can create problems with engines, so it does need to be used fairly quickly after it's processed, within a month or two, and it can't be stored indefinitely without significantly doing things to add antioxidants and things like that. So that's been a little bit of a challenge that we've dealt with there. Biomass also includes municipal waste. Anchorage has been working on a methane project from their municipal waste landfill, collecting gas and then using that for heating homes and power generation. And then Fairbanks has also done some projects. Alaskan has had a project that was going on until a couple of years ago, where they were actually densifying waste, cardboard, and paper that was diverted from the landfill here, and using that to supplement coal in their power plant. That shut down a few years ago, but there are other projects that are very close to completion, including one that's sort of a spin-off of the Chena Hot Springs project that Chena is working on out in North Pole. One opportunity is, while we can use naturally growing wood, another opportunity is to actually grow a biomass energy crop, and that's something that's being considered in many places of the state. This is an example of a project in New York where you're growing willows and you're harvesting those in the winter, and in this case they're also using that to co-fire with coal in a local power plant. The problem that we've really seen, because the university's been really looking at this option, is that things grow pretty slowly here. We think of things as growing quickly. The leaves come out very quickly in the spring, but actually transferring that into mass, actually wood mass, is actually a longer process than we think. And so as much as I'm convinced that the alders on my trail in the back of my yard grow at least 10 feet every year, it doesn't appear that that's actually the case. So that's been a challenge. I haven't talked about efficiency at all, and I really don't want to miss talking about it, because it's the first thing that all of us can be doing on an individual home owner level or as a community to address our energy costs the quickest and the most effectively. Golden Valley's had some very good energy sense programs, business sense programs that have really done this community well in terms of trying to reduce our energy costs. Our program is more focused on generation efficiency, so we deal more with trying to improve efficiency of diesel generators and that side of the equation rather than end-use efficiency. Cooperative Extension at the university works on end-use efficiency, as does Cold Climate Housing Research Center here, and we partner with those organizations. But Alaska energy use has increased in the last 20 years by 18%, while our population has decreased by 7%. A lot of that is because of industrial use of energy in the state, so I'm not sure I take too much away from that, but some people would argue that we haven't done as much about efficiency and conservation as we could. So again, one of the things that we're working on at the university through the Alaska Center for Energy and Power is improving efficiency of our existing diesel generators, making better use of the heat that's available from those generators by operating local greenhouses. We have a project in Galena that we are hoping to put a greenhouse in Galena and use waste heat from their diesel generators. And we also are working with several communities in the interior to just improve the efficiency of their existing diesel generators. I want to mention a little bit more. I talked earlier about how energy is really critical in terms of driving Alaska's economy. And that's been largely based on fossil energy in the past, and I think that that's probably going to happen well into the future. But we want to be thinking long term, and we also want to be thinking about ways that we can be exporting Alaska's energy in ways other than through pipelines or through electric power lines. And that's really through value-added processing of goods and services that we use, and building more industrial opportunities for the state. So now some of the things that have been considered are geothermal and the Aleutians. Susitna and Chakachamma are the two hydro projects I mentioned earlier, Mount Spurs, the geothermal project. These are larger energy projects that could supply energy for some key anchor customers that could help drive Alaska's economy into the future. Power for remote mines, that's a huge issue with many remote mining opportunities, is that there isn't readily available energy at a lot of these sites, and that's a big challenge in terms of the cost of developing some of those projects. We partner with the Petroleum Development Laboratory on also looking at ways to optimize our existing fossil energy resources. Methane hydrates is an untaped resource that's far more significant worldwide in terms of resource potential than natural gas or oil or coal, probably all of those combined actually. Methane hydrates are generally located under the ocean floor, but in Alaska it's also trapped under permafrost formations, and so it's easier to access here than other places. This is a good place to be studying methane hydrates and whether that's something that we could be tapping as an energy resource, and that's being done right now on a North Slope. The gas pipeline, heavy oil, so we can maximize extraction of our existing oil resources. Carbon sequestration is a big issue that's really coming to the forefront that we've been starting to take a look at, looking at advanced coal technologies, cleaner coal technologies, and then also infrastructure development, high voltage DC transmission lines and things like that. We often think about Alaska as being very remote in terms of a world, our position in the world, it being in the Arctic as we are. And of course, when you look at maps of the lower 48, we're often kind of this island floating off the coast of California or Mexico, somewhere down there. But in reality, we need to rethink how Alaska fits into the world energy picture, because we are dealing with a seasonally free ice in the Arctic, and that is really opening up new opportunities for potential shipping routes, and we are not as isolated as we once were. And so that is just really something that we want to be thinking about, is where we are and how we want to best be taking advantage of our resources to drive new economic opportunities for Alaska based on our position in a new energy and a new world economy here. So, going back to research at the university, energy is very interdisciplinary. We work a lot with private sector. I mentioned with the Wind Diesel Application Center, but there's a huge, almost every one of our projects has private sector involvement. We work with the Denali Commission, which is a federal agency that's active in Alaska, the Alaska Energy Authority. Tanana Chiefs Conference, we have a partnership with them that we've been really proud of over the last year. The University of Alaska, we work with a lot of different parts of the University of Alaska system and several of our national labs. I'm not sure if you can see this list. You might be able to because it's a pretty big screen, but there's a lot of different programs within the University of Alaska that are active in energy research and different parts of energy research. And some of them you might not think about right away, like the Institute of Arctic Biology is one of the programs on that list, but we're working with them to do our fish studies for the hydrokinetics. And so we're bringing researchers into the energy picture that haven't really thought of themselves as being researchers with capacity related to energy. And we're developing these interdisciplinary teams and really starting to attack some of the critical issues that are facing Alaska today. We have projects that are located all over the state and are focused on all different kinds of technologies and ideas that are out there. Research and development is often sort of pushed aside as not really necessary for funding, but it's really critical to attract new investment to the state. A lot of these projects that are happening that are cutting edge technologies, we're able to draw investment of private sector companies that are developing concepts from outside of the state to Alaska, to Fairbanks, to be testing these different types of energy devices, because we can actually do projects here that are cutting edge and new, that are economic in Alaska because of our high energy costs, whereas anywhere else they would not be economic. And so there's interest in doing these kinds of projects in Alaska, and we want to be attracting that kind of investment to the state. We also want to reduce failures. There's always going to be failures when you have energy projects, but you want to minimize those failures, and you want to be making good investments and spending our finances that we have available wisely. Improving existing projects. We really try to narrow the focus of many of the energy projects. There's a lot of communities that have a lot of great ideas out there, and we work with them to kind of trim those down to what the best opportunities and alternatives are. And we also work on helping to provide information to develop energy policy for the state. And of course, creating new jobs is a fantastic opportunity for us. Right now, Alaska ranks 46th nationally in research funding, but I think that that's actually going to change. I just want to leave you with a couple of images from Reykjavik in Iceland. Having worked in the geothermal industry for quite a few years, I've always found Iceland to be sort of an inspirational model, maybe not with their banking system, but with what they've done with their energy projects, which is pretty unrelated. And I think this is kind of an interesting model for Alaska, because in 1932, you know, this is kind of in between the world wars, and all the buildings were heated using fossil fuels. That's where they got all their energy from, was from coal that was imported from Europe. And you know, they really struggled during the world wars with being cut off from their supply lines. They had some very serious issues there. Clearly, their city was, you know, not running the cleanest fossil energy. Kind of looks like downtown Fairbanks sometimes, actually. But anyway. This was Reykjavik at the beginning of the century, and this is Reykjavik today. And they really turned around their situation, which was pretty bleak on their island. I mean, literally, they'd cut down every tree. They really had an environmental disaster on their hands, and they've really turned that around today. It's one of the cleanest cities in the world. They operate off of geothermal and hydropower, and they've managed to attract significant industrial development to their island nation, even though it's a lot more remote than Alaska is. Today, several companies are shipping bauxite ore, which is the ore that aluminum is derived from. They're shipping that from Australia all the way to Iceland to make aluminum. And the reason for that is it's very energy intensive. They need a lot of energy, and these companies, they want to know what their cost of energy is going to be 20 years out, because that makes a big difference to them. If they build a plant, a smeltering plant, and they don't know what the cost of fuel is 20 years out, that's a real burden for them. Excuse me. Whereas here in Reykjavik, they have probably a 20-year contract for power, and that means a lot, and it's been able to really provide an economic driver for that country. The interesting thing is that when they decided to switch over to renewables from the fossil energy resources they've been using, they didn't have an engineering program at the university. They were way behind the curve, and they actually came to the United States and learned everything that they wanted to learn about geothermal from us, from the United States, which was the leader in geothermal at the time, brought that back to Iceland, developed their own program, and today, if you want to do anything in geothermal, at some point you're going to be going to Iceland, because they are the world leaders, and they will, you know, be involved in some way in most geothermal projects around the world, if nothing else, just from people going there to take a look at the model that they have in that country. So it's sort of interesting, and I think that that's really something that Alaska also has some of these same types of opportunities to build an economy around new types of energy for our state. And that's all. So we want to open the floor to questions. Thank you so much for your patience and for joining us tonight.